Right now, as I'm recording this, Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky are meeting in Florida. The meeting started at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. This is potentially the most consequential diplomatic moment of 2025. But let me back up and explain why this matters, what happened in the last 24 hours, and what's actually on the table. Last night, while Americans were settling in after Christmas, Russia launched one of the largest aerial attacks on Ukraine this year. According to Zelensky, Russia fired nearly 500 drones and 40 missiles at Ukraine. The attack lasted almost 10 hours, one of the longest continuous assaults of the entire war. The targets were primarily Kyiv, the capital, energy infrastructure, residential buildings, civilian areas. At least one person was killed, a 71-year-old. 32 others were injured, including 2 children. Over 2,600 residential buildings lost heating in the middle of winter. Temperatures in Kyiv are below freezing. Why does the timing matter? Because Zelensky had just announced he was flying to Florida to meet Trump. Russia knew about this meeting. This attack was a message, a demonstration of power, a reminder that while diplomats talk, Russia still controls the battlefield. I've been following this war since it started in February 2022. I've watched the diplomatic efforts, the failed negotiations, the shifting battle lines. What's happening right now is different. This isn't symbolic diplomacy. This is endgame negotiation. Let me walk you through what's actually being discussed, who holds the power, and what this means for Ukraine, Russia, and the global order. First, understand Trump's position. He's made ending this war a signature priority of his second administration. He campaigned on it. He's met with both Zelensky and Putin multiple times since returning to office. In August, Putin even visited Alaska for a high-level summit with Trump, something that would have been unthinkable under Biden. Trump believes he's the only person who can broker this deal, and based on current dynamics, he's probably right. The U.S. provides the bulk of military aid to Ukraine. Without American weapons, ammunition, and intelligence, Ukraine's position collapses within months. Trump holds enormous leverage over Zelensky, but Trump also has leverage over Putin. Not military leverage. Russia doesn't depend on U.S. support. But Trump can offer something Putin desperately wants: sanctions relief, international legitimacy, and a pathway back into the global economy. So Trump sits in the middle with both sides needing something only he can provide. That's why he told Politico on Friday, "Zelensky doesn't have anything until I approve it, so we'll see what he's got." That's not diplomatic language. That's a power statement. Trump is telling Zelensky and the world that Ukraine's proposals mean nothing without American approval. Now let's talk about what Zelensky is bringing to this meeting. According to his statements to Ukrainian journalists on Friday, there's a 20-point plan that's about 90% ready. This plan addresses security guarantees for Ukraine, economic reconstruction agreements, and, most controversially, territorial issues. Zelensky confirmed that Donbas is on the table. Donbas is the eastern industrial heartland of Ukraine, specifically Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. Russia currently controls nearly all of Luhansk and about 70% of Donetsk. These areas have been contested since 2014, long before the full-scale invasion. Earlier this week, Zelensky said something unprecedented. He indicated willingness to withdraw Ukrainian troops from Donbas if Russia also pulls back and the area becomes a demilitarized zone monitored by international forces. This would effectively create a frozen conflict, neither Ukraine nor Russia controlling the territory, at least temporarily. This is a massive concession. For 3 years, Zelensky's position was that Ukraine would not cede an inch of territory. Now he's signaling flexibility. Why the change? Because Ukraine is losing. Not catastrophically, not imminently, but the trajectory is clear. Russia has more soldiers, more artillery, more resources. Ukraine has fought heroically and effectively, but Western aid hasn't been sufficient to actually push Russia out. The best Ukraine can hope for militarily is a grinding stalemate, and stalemates favor the side with more resources, which is Russia. Zelensky understands this. His military commanders understand this. So the calculation has shifted from how do we win back all our territory to how do we stop the bleeding and get security guarantees that prevent Russia from attacking again in 5 years? That's where Trump comes in. Zelensky desperately needs a security agreement with the United States, something binding, something that commits America to Ukraine's defense if Russia violates the peace deal. But here's the problem. The U.S. Senate won't ratify a formal treaty. Republicans won't support it. Even many Democrats are skeptical of binding military commitments. So whatever security guarantee Trump offers will be executive action, meaning the next president could reverse it. Zelensky knows this, but he's running out of options, so he's gambling that a Trump-backed deal, even if imperfect, is better than continuing a war Ukraine can't win. Now let's flip to Putin's perspective. Russia has achieved significant military objectives. They control Crimea, most of Donbas, and a land bridge connecting them. They've demonstrated that Western sanctions, while painful, are survivable. They've shown that NATO won't directly intervene. But Russia is also paying enormous costs. The economy is strained. Over 300,000 casualties by conservative estimates. International isolation. Loss of European energy markets. Growing dependence on China. Putin would like to lock in his territorial gains, get sanctions relief, and move on. But he also can't look weak domestically. Russian propaganda has spent 3 years telling the population this is an existential fight against NATO expansion. Putin can't suddenly accept a deal that looks like surrender. That's why Russia continues attacking even during peace talks. It's a negotiating tactic. Demonstrate strength. Remind Ukraine and the West that Russia can keep fighting indefinitely. When Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova was asked about progress in peace talks, she said there's been slow but steady progress. But when asked about territorial concessions, the message was clear. Russia will not withdraw from areas it controls. So here's the core problem. Zelensky is willing to give up Donbas if it becomes a demilitarized zone. Putin wants to keep Donbas under Russian control. These positions are incompatible. That's where Trump's role becomes critical. Can he broker a compromise that both sides can sell domestically? Maybe. The framework that's reportedly being discussed involves, first, a ceasefire along current lines of control. Second, creation of a demilitarized zone in contested areas of Donbas. Third, international monitoring forces, but not NATO troops, possibly UN peacekeepers or a coalition of neutral countries. Fourth, a pathway for Ukraine to eventually hold referendums on the status of these territories, but not immediately, maybe in 10 or 20 years. Fifth, sanctions relief for Russia phased over time, conditional on compliance with ceasefire terms. Sixth, security guarantees for Ukraine from the US and potentially other countries, though the exact form remains vague. Seventh, economic reconstruction package for Ukraine, potentially funded by unlocking frozen Russian assets. This is the general outline. The details are where everything gets complicated. Who monitors the demilitarized zone? What happens if Russia violates the ceasefire? How binding are US security commitments? Can Ukraine join NATO eventually? Or is that permanently off the table? These questions don't have easy answers, and that's why the plan is only 90% ready. The last 10% is often the hardest part. Let me talk about Europe because they're conspicuously absent from today's meeting. Zelensky said he'd like European leaders involved, but it's not happening. This is a bilateral US-Ukraine meeting. Putin isn't even there. Trump will speak with him separately. European leaders are nervous. They've provided enormous support to Ukraine, weapons, aid, hosting refugees. They see Ukraine's fight as defending European security. If Trump brokers a deal that gives Russia too much, Europeans will feel betrayed. But Europe doesn't have leverage. They can't provide the military support Ukraine needs without US participation. And they can't offer Russia the sanctions relief it wants because US sanctions are more impactful than European ones. So Europe is sidelined, reduced to watching and hoping Trump doesn't sell out Ukrainian security. Now let me address what this means practically. If a deal is reached, and that's still a big if, what actually happens? First, there would be a ceasefire. Fighting stops along a defined line. This wouldn't be immediate. It would take days or weeks to implement. Second, both sides would pull back heavy weapons from the demilitarized zone. International monitors would move in. Third, humanitarian access would improve. Aid could reach affected populations. Reconstruction could begin in areas no longer under active combat. Fourth, sanctions on Russia would start lifting gradually, not all at once, but phased based on compliance. Fifth, Ukraine would receive security guarantees and reconstruction funding. The exact amounts and terms would be negotiated. Sixth, and this is the hardest part, the political status of Donbas and Crimea would remain unresolved, frozen, maybe addressed in future negotiations, maybe not. This isn't victory for Ukraine. It's not the outcome they wanted when they courageously resisted Russian invasion in 2022. But it might be the best outcome available given current realities. And here's the brutal truth. Wars don't end when one side wins decisively. They end when both sides realize continued fighting costs more than compromise. Ukraine has fought brilliantly. They've exceeded every expectation. But they can't militarily defeat Russia without far more support than the West is willing to provide. And that support is declining, not increasing. Russia has achieved some objectives, but at enormous cost. Putin would like to declare victory and move on. Trump sees an opportunity to broker a historic deal that burnishes his legacy. So the incentives align for negotiation, even if the specific terms remain contentious. What am I watching to track whether this actually leads to peace? Several things. First, Putin's response. Trump said he expects to speak with Putin soon. If Putin signals openness to the framework being discussed, momentum builds. If he rejects it, talks stall. Second, European reaction. If European leaders express support, that strengthens the deal's legitimacy. If they condemn it as appeasement, implementation becomes harder. Third, Russian military actions. If attacks continue or escalate, it signals Russia isn't serious about peace. If they decrease, it suggests Moscow is genuinely engaging. Fourth, domestic Ukrainian politics. Zelensky said any territorial concessions would require public approval, potentially through referendum. If Ukrainian citizens reject the deal, it collapses regardless of what leaders agree to. Fifth, U.S. congressional response. While Trump can negotiate as president, Congress controls funding. If they refuse to appropriate reconstruction aid or security assistance, the deal lacks substance. My personal view is that we're closer to a deal than at any point since the war began. The pieces are aligning. Trump has motivation and leverage. Zelensky is desperate for relief. Putin wants sanctions lifted. But the last 10% is always the hardest. Details matter enormously, and implementation is where deals often fail. I'm cautiously optimistic that fighting could wind down in 2026, but I'm skeptical that whatever deal emerges will address the underlying causes of this conflict: Russian imperialism, NATO expansion fears, and the struggle for influence over Eastern Europe. This might end the hot war. It probably won't end the cold peace. But again, I'm not a foreign policy expert. This is my personal analysis based on publicly available reporting. Everyone's perspective is different. You should form your own views. What I'm saying is this: pay attention to what happens in the next few days. If Trump and Zelensky emerge with a joint statement, if Putin signals acceptance, if fighting decreases, those are signs a deal is real. If today's meeting ends without clear progress, if attacks continue, if rhetoric escalates, then we're in for more months or years of war. The stakes couldn't be higher: Ukraine's future, Russia's trajectory, the credibility of U.S. diplomacy, the integrity of European security. And it all comes down to what happens in a room in Florida today between Trump and Zelensky. Stay informed. Watch the developments. This is history being made in real time.